knowledge of ancient times will come from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
In the previous video, our discussions of the discovery of the two Isaiah scrolls from Qumran Cave 1 shows the high degree of popularity and strong proclivity for the preservation of the book of Isaiah particularly, and the Hebrew Bible more generally, for the writers and the collectors of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the last centuries before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. The manuscripts also demonstrate the malleability of the text as late as the 1st century BCE through the existence of numerous textual variants and, most prominently, evidence for substantial revision and editorial activity. A careful appraisal of the data from just a comparison of these two scrolls, that's 1Q Isaiah A and 1Q Isaiah B, indicates that only shortly before the time of Jesus, the text of the Bible was still being negotiated, updated, shaped, and improved to suit the ever-changing needs of Jewish communities who cherished it. But that's just one biblical book from one cave. In total, there were tens of thousands of fragments from nearly 1,000 manuscripts discovered in several caves in the Dead Sea region over a roughly 20-year period, starting in or around 1947. Discoveries from the 11 caves near Qumran, as well as from Murabat, the synagogue Geniza at Masada, Nachal Hever, and Wadi Seir, yielded most of what we have come to refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hundreds, but not all or even most, of these manuscripts are what scholars have designated biblical scrolls. And this is because they appear to be copies of texts that are presently contained within the Hebrew Bible or the Protestant Old Testament. But I fear that what is so often missed or misconstrued by casual observers and interested lay people within this designation is the idea that these manuscripts represent the Bible for the people who wrote and collected these texts, and for Judaism at large. To be sure, we cannot even be confident that the Jewish community who owned these scrolls thought of what we consider the Bible any more special than many of the hundreds of other literary texts that they also collected. In truth, biblical scrolls is just a shorthand designation that developed from the necessity of the first scholars who were tasked with sorting, editing, and publishing this vast trove of new literary material. You see, there was so much of it that it had to be first quickly and efficiently sorted and classified, and the simplest way to do this was to work from what was known, which was primarily the biblical texts, but also other known pieces of ancient Jewish literature like Ben Sira, Tobit, Jubilees, First Enoch, etc. Undoubtedly, the presuppositions of the first scholars also played a big role in how they thought about, organized, and interpreted the scrolls. But in the decades since the discoveries, scholars have had the time and ever-improving resources to more carefully consider this much more complex network of texts at Qumran and how we ought to think about them. For example, the Isaiah scrolls from Qumran Cave 1 that we explored in the last video are large, exquisitely crafted, and very expensive works of art. Seems obvious from their physical features that these were highly regarded, treasured pieces of literature, scriptures, to be sure. But then, what about some of the other large manuscripts also found in the same cave, written and preserved with the same obsessive level of care? You will recall when we left off in our story of the discovery of the scrolls, the young Bedouin shepherds, Adib and his cousins Juma Muhammad and Khalil Musa, had removed the three scrolls, that's 1Q Isaiah A, the Community Rule, and the Pesher Habakkuk, from Qumran Cave 1. After some time, weeks or even months, the Bedouin group made their way west to Bethlehem, and Muhammad and Musa, while on a supply run in town, showed the scrolls to several local merchants, but they did not inspire much interest. One of these merchants, a Syrian Orthodox peddler named George Ishaya, mentioned the scrolls he had seen to the metropolitan at St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem, Mar Athanasius Samuel, thinking that the writing on the leather might be Syriac. In the intervening time, Muhammad and Musa had left the scrolls with another Syrian Orthodox shopkeeper, a cobbler named Khalil Iskandar Shahin, now more famously known as Kando. Mar Samuel, upon recognizing the potential importance of such a discovery, dispatched Ishaya to get more information about the scrolls from the Bedouin. He then contacted Kando himself and instructed him to purchase the scrolls if he could. So then, sometime in the week of 14th to the 21st of April 1947, Ishaya and Kando together brought one of the scrolls, the Serach HaYacha, the Community Rule, 1QS, to the Metropolitan, at which point he could see that the writing was Hebrew and not Syriac as he had first supposed. In the following months, Ishaya, along with the Bedouin, returned to the cave and retrieved 4 more scrolls. A collection of hymns and prayers, this is the so-called Chorayot, or 1QH, a second copy of Isaiah, that's 1Q Isaiah B, which we discussed in the last video, and the now famous War Scroll, 1QM. The fourth manuscript, you will recall, was a dried, shriveled roll of leather that was too fragile to open. But it was then later identified as an inventive retelling of stories from the patriarchal narratives in Genesis, what has come to be known as the Genesis Apocryphon. Mar Samuel would eventually purchase the Genesis Apocryphon along with 1Q Isaiah A, the Pesher Habakkuk, and 1QS for 25 Palestinian pounds, from which Kando took a commission of 8 pounds. So, consider a pair of these other scrolls found in this first cave, the Chorayot, the so-called Thanksgiving hymns, and Milchama, or the War Scroll. These are equally as large, impressive, and as meticulously crafted as the copies of Isaiah we discussed in the previous video. So, were these previously unknown compositions also thought by their owners and handlers to likewise be scripture, in the same sense as Isaiah? Or what about the shriveled roll of leather that we now know as the Genesis Apocryphon? This is a substantially damaged, incomplete copy of a very large manuscript written in Aramaic, which freely retold stories of Noah and Abraham and perhaps others of the patriarchs in such a sensational way as to make it nearly unrecognizable as a copy of Genesis, while following the same narrative arc as Genesis. So what is it? This was clearly, like the other scrolls mentioned here, another large, expertly produced, and extremely expensive treasure, a prized possession of enormous value to its owners. Was it part of their scriptures? How would we even know one way or the other? These are questions that began to percolate among scholars in earnest starting in the 1960s when the great Oxford professor Geza Vermesh published his monumental volume, Scripture and Tradition in Judaism, Haggadic Studies. Vermesh was working from ideas that were promoted by his colleague, René Bloch, who had begun to argue persuasively that the dauntingly huge collection of expansive biblical tales we know through the rabbinic midrashim was the end result of a centuries-long process of scripture transmission, which was already seen in scriptural texts like Deuteronomy or Chronicles. These texts extended older scriptures through an ambitious program of rewriting and implicit interpretation that wove volumes of new material seamlessly into the source text to create something almost entirely different, but no less significant. Vermesh saw a close relationship between the literary and exegetical techniques in these scriptural texts and much later products of rabbinic midrash. And he concluded that these were all forms of what he called rewritten Bible. For Vermesh, rewritten Bible texts were any that exhibited a close attachment in narrative and themes to some book contained in the present Jewish canon of scripture and some type of reworking, whether through rearrangement, conflation, or supplementation of the canonical biblical text. So what Vermesh is essentially saying here is that texts like the Genesis Apocryphon were an extension of an ancient process by which the whole Bible was produced by carefully and artfully rewriting the older sacred text to fit with contemporary circumstances, changes in ideology, politics, and whatnot. It's how hypothetical Pentateuchal sources, the Yahwist, the Elohist, and priestly became the Torah, or how Proto-Isaiah developed to include large expansions in Deutero and Trito-Isaiah, and how Septuagint Jeremiah was altered and expanded into Masoretic Jeremiah. In this sense, the only difference between the book of Deuteronomy and the Genesis Apocryphon was a matter of time and language. But when speaking of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were all produced between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, the situation is massively complicated because there is no clear view on what this community, or nearly any Jewish community for that matter, even considered to be Bible. So if we can't even identify what the Bible is, how can we then begin to speak about biblical texts? This all becomes much more evident as new discoveries continue to be made after 1947. In the unfolding of happenstance, the first scrolls were discovered just as the British Mandate for Palestine was coming to an end, and with it came escalating tensions in Jerusalem that forced the American and European scholars working at the American School of Oriental Research, or ASOR, to evacuate. The proclamation of nationhood in Israel in 1948 set new boundary lines that left the Old City, ASOR, and the Palestinian Archaeological Museum, where the St. Mark scrolls were being housed, on the Jordanian side, and the fledgling state nationalized all the cultural heritage materials that they retained on their side. G. Lancaster Harding was the director of the Antiquities Department in the British Mandate, and he was retained by the Jordanian government in the same post. With the support of the Arab Legion, Lancaster Harding had determined at the outset to locate and then to excavate the cave near Wadi Qumran where the scrolls were discovered. So, on the 28th of January, 1949, the captain of the Legion found Qumran Cave 1, and Lancaster Harding undertook preparations for excavations in cooperation with the Dominican French School of Archaeology, l'École biblique et archéologique française, otherwise known as the École biblique, and under the capable oversight of Professor Pere Roland de Vaux. The cave was excavated between February and March and yielded numerous potsherds dating to the Roman period, and more significantly, of the same type as the distinctive jars that had been purchased by Eliezer Sukenik. De Vaux and Lancaster Harding also found small fragments and bits of some 70 scrolls, a number of which were positively identified with the 7 Dead Sea Scrolls now divided between the State of Israel and Palestine. In the following years, De Vaux would also begin extensive excavations at the ruin alongside Wadi Qumran, 1 kilometer south of the cave. These came to be understood as the remains of an isolated residence of a group of ascetic religious Jews in the 1st century BCE who wrote and collected the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that's for a later video. In October 1951, the Bedouin discovered another series of caves with manuscript fragments south of Bethlehem, about 18 kilometers from Qumran. The site is known as Mutabat and was then excavated by DeVoe and the archaeologists in 1952. Mutabat yielded about 120 documents, including letters, deeds, and contracts, and several biblical scrolls, all dated to the 2nd century CE and positively identified with the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba, or Bar Kokhba, in 132 to 135. Between 1952 and 1955, the Bedouin and the archaeologists scoured the region for more caves and more manuscripts. The archaeologists discovered Qumran Cave 2 in February 1952, yielding fragments of about 30 scrolls in close proximity of Qumran Cave 1. They discovered Qumran Cave 3 in March, 2 kilometers north of Qumran, and yielding some 15 manuscripts, including the spectacular, essentially intact copper scroll, an inventory of temple treasures etched onto 240 centimeters of beaten copper. In August 1952, the Bedouin discovered a massive trove of fragments numbering in the thousands. Rumors of this discovery circulated for weeks among the archaeologists before the Bedouin ever confessed to its existence. They continued to deliver fragments to the École Biblique to sell, but were convinced that they would be worth more to the scholars if they believed they had come from Qumran Cave 1. Unlike the other caves discovered to this point, this was a man-made cave, only about 200 meters south of the Qumran ruins. It came to be known as Qumran Cave 4, and it produced an inventory of well over 500 manuscripts. Upon finally learning of the cave, archaeologists set to excavate there in September and discovered about 1,000 additional small fragments, many of which were eventually positively identified with the scrolls removed by the Bedouin. DeVoe and his team also noticed the presence of notches in the wall of the cave, indicating the probable construction of shelving units of some sort, thought to be for the storage of scrolls by their original owners. But the discovery of this new cave, Qumran Cave 4, changed everything in ways that we are still grappling with. Not only was this such a large collection of manuscripts, but the fact that this was a man-made cave has helped to demonstrate that this huge cache of literature was very much like an ancient library, complete with multiple copies of many of the same compositions. Moreover, numerous fragments found in Qumran Cave 4 also contain text from the scrolls found in Qumran Cave 1. There were copies of the Community Rule, the War Scroll, and the Kodayot, but often containing considerable differences in content and arrangement. There were over 100 individual scrolls representing nearly every biblical book from Genesis to Chronicles. But very interestingly, in the same cave were found different versions of the same books. So alongside copies of Exodus, Samuel, and Jeremiah that followed the Masoretic text, there were also copies that aligned with the much different versions of these books known from the Septuagint, but written in Hebrew. Here is a fragment that contains text from Jeremiah chapter 43, which appears at the end of the Septuagint version. While this fragment is quite small, the damage pattern clearly indicates that this survives the end of this document, tightly wound on the inside of the scroll, hence a Hebrew copy of the Septuagint arrangement and text of Jeremiah. There were also large numbers of other previously known early Jewish texts like 1st Enoch and Jubilees, both dramatic rewritings of the early chapters of Genesis. The sheer numbers of copies of these texts has indicated to scholars that they were just as popular as so-called biblical works like Exodus or Joshua or Samuel, and clearly even more popular than books from the Bible like Kings, Chronicles, and Nehemiah and Ezra. So, what does this do to our understanding of their view of the biblical text? And then the implications from this question become much more pronounced in view of the fact that our biblical texts are inextricably joined to ancient ideas about the text. This brings us finally to a set of 4 or 5 manuscripts found in Qumran Cave 4 that had first been construed to be copies of the Pentateuch, written as a single composition by an individual author using a biblical base text, which he extensively altered through harmonistic editing, similar to what is seen in the Samaritan Pentateuch. But as the original editors, Emmanuel Tove and Sidney White Crawford, continued to work through the hundreds of fragments in this grouping, they discovered that these texts also incorporated substantial amounts of new material not found elsewhere in the Pentateuch, presumably included by the scribe. So if one is to believe my Dr. Vater, George Brooke, he is the one who came up with the now familiar designation for these texts, Reworked Pentateuch, or RP, during a work stay at Penn State in the mid-90s, where Tove was also on a visit for a conference. In any event, these manuscripts, while incomplete, appear to have likely each contained the whole Torah from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and were similar in respects to the Samaritan Pentateuch, in that scribes inserted parallel sections from other parts of the Torah to bring them all together in harmony. So for example, where 4Q-RPB, or 4Q-364, tells the story of Moses' encounter with the king of Edom at Kadesh in Deuteronomy 2, the scribe has inserted text from the parallel account in Numbers 20, verses 17 to 18. It seems clear from the so-called reworked Pentateuch scrolls that their handlers viewed this entire Torah as a unified whole, which then affected the way in which scribes copied these texts. There are numerous similar such instances of harmonization throughout these scrolls, but in addition to these, RP also contains sections of new text from outside the Pentateuch or from elsewhere altogether. For example, the Qumran Essenes who collected these scrolls would celebrate only those festivals that were mandated by Moses, which is why they recognize neither Hanukkah nor Purim, which were introduced in 1st and 2nd Maccabees and in Esther. However, the Qumranites did celebrate festivals of new wine and oil. But these festivals do not appear in Moses' description of the annual calendar in Leviticus chapter 23 and 24. So this could have been problematic, but in 4Q-RPC, that's 4Q-365, the scribe has added both to the official enumeration of Israel's festivals in a greatly expanded form of Leviticus chapter 24, verse 2. We read in 4Q365, fragment 23, the following. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Command the children of Israel, saying, When you come to the land which I am giving to you for an inheritance, and you dwell upon it securely, you will gather wood for the burnt offering and for all the work of the house which you will build for me in the land, to arrange them upon the altar of the burnt offering and the calves. And then there's a break. For Passover sacrifices and for whole burnt offerings and for thanksgivings and for free will offerings and for burnt offerings daily. Then there's another break. And for the doors and for all the work of the house they will bring, and then another break, festival of new oil. They will bring the wood to, then another break. Those who bring on the first day, Levi, Reuben, and Simeon, and on the fourth day, and then a substantial break. So then, what we see happening here is an example of the theological commitments and practices of this particular Jewish community affecting their own handling of the text of what they would consider scripture. The solution to maintaining their view of the religious calendar is to ascribe the mandate for their preferred festivals to Moses himself, as recorded in Leviticus. Ever since the publication of Rework Pentateuch in 1994, scholars have continued to raise objections about the designation for these manuscripts, since classifying them as reworked still prioritizes an authoritative underlying text when there is really no evidence to assume this hierarchy. In more recent years, these critiques have now prompted Emmanuel Tove, one of the original editors, to rename these scrolls simply 4Q Pentateuch, out of the recognition that, for all intents and purposes, they seem to be just that for the Qumran Essenes. The existence of these manuscripts and the evolution of scholars thinking about them, from exegetical text to actual copies of scripture, is a vivid illustration of the problem raised by the question posed at the beginning of this video. What even is a biblical text? I'm not sure it is a question we can adequately answer, but in one more illustration of the problem, we're going to conclude with these. A handful of small manuscripts from Qumran Cave 4, which contain only small portions of the book of Deuteronomy. Of the 29 copies of Deuteronomy found at Qumran that we mentioned in the first video, 19 came out of Qumran Cave 4. And out of these 19, at least 4 contained only small excerpts of Deuteronomy, from the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, also mixing text with Exodus 20, and the so-called Shema in Deuteronomy 6, and the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. You will recall from the first video the Nash Papyrus, which is a similar type of scroll containing small excerpts of text from Exodus and Deuteronomy. So these scrolls were probably used for liturgies or ritual performances of some sort, quite separate from the much larger sacred scrolls like those surveyed above and in the previous video. But these small excerpted texts from Deuteronomy are counted in some inventories as biblical scrolls, and this on its own is problematic in that it communicates something about these manuscripts that is almost certainly not really reflective of their usage. Moreover, a couple of these manuscripts, 4Q Deuteronomy J, 4Q 37, and 4Q Deuteronomy Q, 4Q 44, are particularly interesting because they preserve forms of the text of Deuteronomy 32 that predate any other known version, and they provide ample evidence for the process of editing the text of Scripture in antiquity. So the reconstructed text of 4Q 37, fragment 12, written approximately in or around 50 CE, is from Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9. In this passage, the chief god of the region, Elyon, is pictured dividing his territory amongst the council of the gods. When Elyon apportioned the nations, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the boundaries of the people according to the sons of God. In the following verse, Israel's tribal deity, Yahweh, is distinguished from the chief god, Elyon. Thus, Yahweh's portion, that is, the one he received as an inheritance from his father, Elyon, is his people Jacob, the region of his hereditary property. The translator of this text into Greek rendered the Hebrew construction B'nai Elohim, sons of God, into Angelon Theou, the angels of God. By the time of the Hellenistic period, it had become commonplace to reimagine the lower members of the Canaanite pantheon as angels, and not actual gods, as they were clearly presented in the text, such as this and others, like in Genesis 6 or Job 1 and various Psalms. So this is dramatically different from what appears in the standard Hebrew version in the Masoretic text, as well as in the Samaritan Pentateuch, which has changed Bene Elohim to Bene Yisrael, the sons of Israel. So why has this earlier version of the text survived in this ritual scroll? A good explanation for what has taken place was recently provided by Benjamin Ziemer, who argues persuasively that the redaction of this particular text was not merely for the purpose of downplaying the polytheistic roots of Israelite or Canaanite religion, but was also about harmonizing the very ancient Song of Moses with the rest of Deuteronomy. According to Ziemer, the Pentateuch is structured by a more or less coherent system of numbers and personal and geographic names. A number of the sons of God, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 in the Old Greek and in 4Q Deuteronomy J, does not at all fit in this system. By contrast, the number of the sons of Israel is well established within the Pentateuch. 70 names are specified in Genesis 46 verses 8 and following under the rubric, these are the names of the sons of Israel. And the number 70 is mentioned explicitly in Genesis 46 verse 27. It's repeated in Exodus chapter 1 verse 5 and again in Deuteronomy 10 verse 22. This number equals the names of the people specified in the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10, and that's in the Masoretic text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and in the Septuagint. So the equation of the borders of the nations with the number of the sons of Israel in Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 of the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch is well founded in the Pentateuchal composition, but was less impressive for the Greek translator of Deuteronomy, and it had no relevance at all for the independent transmission of the poem. The song is an independent composition that circulated on its own, as well as in the larger later text of the rest of Deuteronomy, where it had to be adjusted to align with Deuteronomy and with the Torah at large. So Ziemer's observation is bolstered by another of these excerpted ritual texts, 4Q Deuteronomy Q, or 4Q 44. This one from around the mid-1st century BCE, which preserves another older part of the Song of Moses and likewise shows how the Masoretic text and the Samaritan Pentateuch have been substantially revised to align with the larger book of Deuteronomy. On fragments 2 to 5, column 1, is preserved the text of Deuteronomy 32 verses 37 to 41 in an intriguing stichometric or poetical arrangement of 3 sets of parallel statements. The text here reads, "Praise, O heaven, his people. Bow down before him, all you gods. For he will avenge the blood of his sons and take vengeance on his adversaries. He will repay those who hate him and cleanse his people's land." For a later redactor, the problematic polytheistic elements in this part of the song required the same kind of corrections that we saw in Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 to 9. But this was a more difficult task because of the poetical arrangement. As such, he changed blood of his sons to blood of his servants, and then removed the second stanza in the first stako. But this then created an imbalance in the poem as a whole, so he then cleverly opted also to eliminate the first stanza of the third stiko, thus producing a new construction of 2 sets of parallel statements in a chiastic pattern that we know from the Masoretic text. Sing praises, nations, for his people. For the blood of his servants he will avenge. He will wreak vengeance on his enemies and cleanse the land of his people. These sorts of texts from Qumran are incredibly significant, for they not only throw our modern perspective of the Bible into sharp contrast with the more ancient views, but they also reveal much about the complicated textual history of the Bible and the editorial rationales and processes that were undertaken to produce the much later standardized texts. So in summary, the massive discovery in 1952 of hundreds of manuscripts from Qumran Cave 4 have completely revolutionized our understanding of what even is the biblical text. It reveals a pluriformity of versions of individual books, of various redactional techniques for transmitting and improving them, and of types of scrolls with different functions, which both enlighten and complicate our knowledge of how the early Jews understood Scripture. But the question of what the Bible was in ancient Judaism is only a starting point. In the next series of videos, we will begin to examine what the first century Jews did with those scriptures as we start to explore the vast amounts of scriptural commentary and prophecies that are revealed in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm Kipp Davis. Thanks for watching. My sincere thanks to Lachlan Davis, who provided the phenomenal map animation for this episode. Lachlan runs a great YouTube channel titled Bible Unboxed, in which he features short, high production value teaching videos about the Bible. Please go and subscribe. As always, thanks to my patrons, without whom this video series does not happen. If you like what I do and want to support my public and academic work, you can join my Patreon for as little as $5 a month. You will get early access to all my videos and more.